Melissa Gilbert just made horrified confession about Dean Butler as her husband on Little House. She was 15 years old when a grown man kissed her on national television, and decades later, Melissa Gilbert finally admitted just how uncomfortable that moment really was. For years, fans of Little House on the Prairie saw Laura and Almanzo as one of the most beloved love stories on television. But behind the cameras, the real story was far more complicated and far more honest than anything that ever aired on NBC. Today we're breaking down what Melissa Gilbert actually said about her on-screen husband Dean Butler, why the truth about their pairing shocked so many fans, and how one classic television romance hid a very real and very human discomfort that neither actor talked about for years. Stick around, because this story goes much deeper than a simple TV kiss. Before we get into the Dean Butler story, it helps to understand who Melissa Gilbert really is, because her entire life reads like something out of a novel. She was born on May 8, 1964, and her path into the world was anything but simple. Her birth parents, a young couple who felt they weren't ready to raise a child, made the decision to place her for adoption almost immediately. The very next day, she was welcomed into the home of actor and comedian Paul Gilbert and his wife Barbara Crane, a dancer and actress in her own right. The couple would later adopt a son as well, Jonathan Gilbert, who would go on to act alongside Melissa on the very show that made her famous. Her childhood took a difficult turn early on. Her parents divorced when she was only 6, and years later her father passed away. For a long time, Melissa believed he had died from a stroke. It wasn't until much later that she learned the real cause of his death was suicide, a revelation that hit her hard. She has spoken about the months of sleeplessness, loss of appetite, and grief that followed once she learned the truth, and about how that kind of loss reshapes a person long after the funeral is over. Despite the pain at home, Melissa's career took off early. She started with small commercial work, including an ad for dog food, before her life changed entirely thanks to a school friend. That friend happened to be the daughter of director Michael Landon, and it was through that connection that Melissa learned she had been cast as Laura Ingalls in a new NBC series based on the beloved books by Laura Ingalls Wilder. She beat out hundreds of other young actresses for the role, and by the time the pilot aired in 1973, it was clear the show had struck a chord with audiences across the country. Little House on the Prairie went on to become one of the defining family dramas of its era, following the Ingalls family as they built a life on the frontier in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Much of the show followed Laura's growth from a mischievous schoolgirl into a young woman, and eventually into a wife. That transformation is exactly where Dean Butler entered the story, playing Almanzo Wilder, the man Laura would eventually marry. Here's where things get interesting, and where the real story behind the scenes starts to look very different from anything viewers saw on their television screens. When Almanzo and Laura first meet on the show, Dean Butler's character was 23 years old. Melissa Gilbert's character, and Melissa herself, was only 15. That is not a small gap for a first kiss scripted for network television, and both actors have since been open about how strange the entire situation felt at the time. Years later, at a 50th anniversary reunion event for the cast, Dean Butler was asked what he would change about his time on the show if he could go back. His answer wasn't about missed opportunities or bigger storylines. It was about that age gap and how uncomfortable it made certain scenes, particularly the ones that called for romance between two characters played by an adult man and a teenage girl. He didn't shy away from admitting that it created a strange dynamic on set, one that the show's writers and producers didn't seem especially concerned about at the time, even though the actors themselves clearly felt the weight of it. Melissa has echoed that discomfort in her own way. In her memoir, she gave the chapter about meeting Dean Butler a blunt and telling title, essentially joking that she had been expecting the producers to cast someone closer to her own age, and instead got, in her words, a real grown man. She has said she didn't just feel awkward about the pairing creatively. She felt genuinely nervous about what it meant to be a teenage girl expected to perform intimate scenes with an adult actor, all while millions of families watched at home every week. The most talked about moment of their on-screen relationship was their first kiss, which aired during an episode called Sweet 16. It's remembered fondly by fans and was even honored years later with an award from TV Land for one of the most memorable kisses in television history. But what a lot of viewers never knew is what was happening just off camera during filming. Melissa's mother was on set that day, and according to Melissa, she was so upset watching her young daughter kiss a grown man on camera that she began crying loudly enough to disrupt filming. Michael Landon, who directed the episode, reportedly had to stop the take because of the commotion. It wasn't just Melissa's mother who had concerns. Melissa herself has said her mother never fully approved of Dean Butler's casting because of how old he was compared to her. It's a detail that adds an entirely new layer to a scene that, for decades, was remembered simply as a sweet piece of nostalgic television. Melissa has said publicly that everyone assumed that on-screen kiss was her actual first kiss in real life too, but that wasn't true. She'd already had a first kiss of her own away from the cameras, with a boy who had nothing to do with the show at all. She has said she often wished she could have shared that with Dean at the time, if only to ease some of the pressure he must have felt playing a romantic lead opposite someone so much younger. That pressure wasn't one-sided either. Dean Butler was a young man in his early 20s, living independently, driving his own car, dating like any other adult his age. Melissa, meanwhile, was a sheltered teenager who wasn't even allowed to wear high heels or get her ears pierced by her family. The distance between their real lives was just as wide as the age gap itself, and both of them have acknowledged that gap made their required on-screen chemistry far more complicated to perform than audiences ever realized. What makes this story stand out today is not that something scandalous happened. It didn't. Both Dean Butler and Melissa Gilbert have spoken about this openly and respectfully, always emphasizing that their working relationship was professional and that the discomfort came from the situation itself, not from anything either of them did wrong. What they're both finally being honest about, decades later, is how television in the 1970s and 1980s often asked young actors to perform adult storylines without much thought given to how that might affect them. It's a broader conversation happening across Hollywood right now, as more former child stars reflect on their early careers with the benefit of hindsight, and Melissa Gilbert has been one of the most candid voices in that conversation. Her honesty about Dean Butler is really just one part of a much bigger pattern in her life, because Melissa Gilbert has rarely been afraid to speak plainly about difficult chapters most celebrities would rather leave buried. After Little House ended, she stayed busy across film and television, taking on roles ranging from a missionary in a biographical drama to a guest arc on the science fiction series Babylon 5 alongside her then-husband Bruce Boxleitner. She even lent her voice to Batgirl in the beloved 90s animated series before eventually being replaced in a later spin-off. In 1985, she received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and years after that she was inducted into the Western Performers Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City, cementing her legacy as one of the defining faces of the American frontier drama genre. She also wasn't afraid to take on more provocative material as an adult, including a memorable arc on the medical drama Nip Tuck. And in a full-circle moment, she returned to her most famous role decades later, stepping into the part of Caroline Ingalls, the mother figure from the original series, in a stage musical adaptation that toured for a couple of years before wrapping up its run. Beyond acting, Melissa built a serious career in industry leadership, serving as president of the Screen Actors Guild in the early 2000s after a hard-fought election. She was re-elected for a second term before choosing not to run again. That same drive toward public service eventually pulled her toward electoral politics. After she and her third husband, actor and director Timothy Busfield, relocated to Michigan, Melissa became deeply involved in local campaigns, going door to door and speaking publicly on behalf of candidates she believed in. That grassroots work eventually led to her own campaign for a seat in the United States House of Representatives in 2016, a run she has said came from a genuine desire to help families she felt had been left behind economically. Unfortunately, that campaign ended early due to health issues, compounded by a very public and very embarrassing tax controversy involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid federal and state taxes, which she has said stemmed from a slow period in her career combined with the financial fallout of divorce. Her personal life has been just as complicated as her professional one. She was once engaged to actor Rob Lowe, a relationship that ended after infidelity on both sides, and an unplanned pregnancy that ultimately didn't work out. She later married actor Beau Brinkman, a marriage marked by early struggles and, according to Melissa, infidelity that she discovered herself shortly after giving birth to their son. Her second marriage, to Bruce Boxleitner, lasted 16 years and produced her second son, though she has admitted in her memoir that the marriage effectively ended emotionally long before it ended on paper. It was her third marriage, to Timothy Busfield, that finally gave her the stability she had spent years searching for. The two met by chance at a nearly empty bar near Universal Studios, and, according to both of them, it was an instant connection that led to marriage within about a year. Busfield, known for his roles in 30-something, Field of Dreams, and The West Wing, has said the two of them approached their relationship as true equals, something Melissa has said meant more to her than almost anything else, especially after growing up in an industry that constantly told her what she had to do rather than what she wanted to do. Together, the couple eventually left the pressures of Los Angeles and New York behind entirely, settling into a renovated cottage in the Catskill Mountains. It was there, during the early days of the pandemic, that Melissa began documenting their new rural lifestyle online, an effort that eventually turned into her memoir Back to the Prairie, released in 2022. In that book and in interviews since, she has spoken candidly about giving up the pressure to chase youth through cosmetic procedures, choosing instead to embrace getting older naturally with her husband's support. She has also been open about darker chapters, including a period of heavy drinking in her late 30s that she says was triggered by grief following her grandfather's death. She has said she eventually reached a breaking point and sought help through therapy and support groups, choosing sobriety for good afterward. Even later, when she suffered a broken back during a stage production and a concussion during a stint on a celebrity dance competition, she refused pain medication entirely, determined not to risk falling back into old patterns. Today, she works with organizations focused on preventing prescription drug misuse among young people, using her own experience as a cautionary example. So, where does that leave the story about Dean Butler? In many ways, it's the most human part of her entire story. Not a scandal, not a secret romance, but a simple, uncomfortable truth about what it was like to be a teenage actress asked to perform grown-up love scenes on a hit television show, and what it meant for the grown man on the other side of that scene, who by all accounts never wanted to make anyone uncomfortable either. Both Melissa and Dean have chosen, decades later, to be honest about that discomfort rather than pretend the fairy tale version of their on-screen romance tells the whole story. That kind of honesty is rare in Hollywood, where nostalgia often gets polished into something simpler and sweeter than it actually was. Melissa Gilbert's willingness to revisit her own history, the good and the uncomfortable parts alike, is part of what has made her such an enduring and respected figure decades after Little House first aired. She's not interested in tearing down the show that made her famous. She clearly still loves it and still speaks fondly of the people she worked with. But she's also not interested in pretending everything about making it was as simple as it looked from the living room couch. If there's one takeaway from her story and from Dean Butler's, it's that the entertainment industry has changed the way it thinks about young performers, and that change came largely because people like Melissa Gilbert were willing to speak up about their own experiences long after the cameras stopped rolling. Her career, her marriages, her political run, her sobriety, and yes, even that famous first kiss with Dean Butler, all point to the same thing, a woman who has never been afraid to tell the truth about her own life, even when the truth is messier than the story audiences fell in love with. What did you think of Melissa Gilbert's honesty about her time on Little House on the Prairie? Let us know in the comments which chapter of her story surprised you the most, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the real stories behind your favorite classic television shows.